குக்கரி சேனலை பார்த்து யார் வேணாலும் சமையல் பண்ணலாம். ஆனா சுவையான சமையல் பண்றது எப்படி? நான் இதயம் நல்லெண்ணெயில சமையல் பண்றேன். ஆஹா ஓஹோன்னு பாராட்டுறாங்க. நீங்களும் இதயம் நல்லெண்ணெயில சமையல் பண்ணுங்க, பாராட்ட வாங்குங்க.
தினம் தோறும் வாங்குவே இதயம் இதயம்.
For decades, that vision did not merely grow in size, it deepened in spirit. Today, the hospital stands as a 650-bed super specialty hospital known across India for its excellence in orthopedics, plastic surgery, trauma care, and its pioneering work in emergency response. One achievement in particular deserves mention, not merely because it is impressive, but because it reveals something essential about the character of this institution. Ganga Hospital has treated over 20,000 trauma patients annually, many of them victims of high-speed road accidents on the busy interstate highway that runs through Coimbatore. Through a disciplined protocol of early cleaning of wounds and swift reconstructive care, the hospital has been able to save limbs in the vast majority of cases, restoring mobility, livelihood, and the dignity to thousands of patients each year. Behind this lie human stories. A young factory worker who returned to his job after an accident that would have otherwise cost him his leg. A schoolgirl who regained full mobility after an injury that once meant lifelong disability. These are not merely medical outcomes. They are reaffirmations of dignity, livelihood, and hope. But Ganga Hospital's contribution has not been confined to clinical excellence. In 2012, Dr. S. Rajashekaran moved the Supreme Court pointing to India's alarming road safety gaps, inadequate trauma centers, poor enforcement of basic safety laws, and the absence of scientific accident investigation or a national emergency care framework. The Supreme Court's recent directions in that continuing matter, delivered only weeks ago, draw directly from the concerns raised in that petition to reduce preventable deaths. This partnership between professional insight and constitutional engagement is what makes institutions like Ganga truly remarkable. They do not see themselves merely as providers of care. They see themselves as custodians of public welfare. In philosophy, we sometimes speak of capability-enhancing institutions, institutions that expand a person's ability to live with dignity, to participate in society, and to exercise freedom in a meaningful way. A hospital that restores a patient's mobility or prevents a family from sinking into poverty due to an accident is doing much more than just medical work. It is enabling citizenship. It is ensuring that a constitutional promise, whether of equality, dignity, or the right to life, is not an abstraction, but a lived experience. There is something profoundly constitutional about this ethic of service. Doctors, nurses, technicians, orderlies, administrators, none of them take an oath to the Constitution. Yet every day they perform acts that protect the values of the Constitution, the values which the Constitution stands for. Care is a constitutional act. Dignity is its language. If we speak today about constitutional culture, citizenship, and civic virtue, then an institution like Ganga Hospital offers us a living example of all three. It shows us that constitutional culture is not cultivated only in courtrooms, classrooms, or legislatures. It is shaped in places where human vulnerability meets human responsibility, in emergency wards, in ambulances, in counseling rooms, in operating theatres, and in the unseen labor of those who choose care over convenience. These are the spaces where the Constitution, without ever being named, is practiced every day. There are moments from the years I have spent in public life that have remained with me far beyond the courtroom. During the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the Supreme Court took up the issue of oxygen allocation across our states, the hearings revealed the fragility of our infrastructure and the courage of those working to hold it together. The country was exhausted, grieving, and afraid. Despite the tireless commitment of many frontline workers, our public health systems were overwhelmed, and institutional preparedness had fallen short of the scale and speed of the crisis. Families lost loved ones because oxygen could not reach them in time. A constitutional promise had faltered. Yet amidst this anguish, we also witnessed something else. Ordinary citizens, civil society groups, volunteers, hospital staffs, and local administrators stepping forward in extraordinary ways. They organized supply chains, verified shortages, created helplines, transported cylinders and medicines, and coordinated across states long before formal systems could formally respond. Their actions could not undo the loss, but they reminded us that the life of the Constitution is sustained not only by institutions, but also by the moral fiber of her people. A similar lesson came years earlier, not in a constitutional bench matter, but in a case involving a young woman with cerebral palsy. Jija Ghosh, who was forcibly deboarded from an aircraft because of her disability. When the case reached the Supreme Court, what moved the bench was not only the breach of her rights, but the everyday indignities she was compelled to endure. Indignities that do not always find their way into legal pleadings. The court held that the act was discriminatory and violative of her dignity, and emphasized that the Constitution demands full and effective participation and inclusion in society. What stayed with me from that case was a simple truth. Our Constitution becomes real not in grand pronouncements, but in the small, unseen places where dignity is either recognized or denied. There is another memory from a visit I made to a government hospital in Maharashtra many years ago. In a crowded ward, I observed a nurse who had been on duty for nearly 14 hours. A distraught family had just been told that their child required an urgent transfer to another facility. The nurse paused, held the mother's trembling hands, and patiently explained what the doctors were doing, what would happen next, and why she should not lose hope. That moment had nothing to do with the law, and yet it had everything to do with justice. Experiences such as these make one reflect on a deeper question of what is it that allows a constitution to live beyond the text written on its pages. Constitution making is a historic act, but constitutional life is a daily one. Václav Havel, the Czech dissident philosopher, wrote that hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing, no matter how it turns out. A constitution survives because a society is willing to confront its own shortcomings, to examine how power is used, how the vulnerable are treated, and how dignity is honored in the small, unrecorded corners of public life. And that brings me to the core of the theme of this oration. When we speak of the endurance of the Indian Constitution, now in its 75th year, we must speak not only of institutions and doctrines, but the values, dispositions, and civic habits that make its ideals meaningful in the everyday life of the nation. These values are expressed through three interconnected ideas: constitutional culture, which shapes law and shapes how a society interprets and lives its founding principles. Citizenship, which goes beyond legal status to define our relationship with one another, and civic virtue, the moral commitment that enables citizens to act for the common good rather than for personal advantage. Today, I hope to reflect on these three ideas not as abstract theories, but as living forces that shape our republic. What they mean, what they demand of us, how they are threatened in a rapidly changing world, and what each of us, regardless of our profession, can do to nurture them. For it is only through this shared effort that a constitution truly comes alive. First, constitutional culture. When we speak of a constitution, we often think of a document, pages bound together, clauses arranged with careful precision, rights enumerated in elegant prose. But every nation eventually learns that a constitution is not sustained by text alone. Text can be amended, ignored, or reduced to symbolism. What endures and what makes a constitution a living force is the culture that grows around it. The Constituent Assembly understood this intuitively in the final days of the Assembly. As Dr. Ambedkar observed in his address, the working of a constitution, he said, does not depend wholly upon the nature of the constitution. The constitution can provide only the organs of state. The factors on which the working of those organs of the state depend are the people and the political parties they will set up as their instruments to carry out their wishes. He reminded us that constitutional morality, the set of habits, conventions, and ethical commitments that sustain democratic life, would matter more than any formal provision. Constitutional morality, Dr. Ambedkar observed, was not a natural instinct. It had to be cultivated, practiced, and taught. Over the last 75 years, our courts have returned to this insight time and again. In S.R. Bommai versus Union of India, the Supreme Court emphasized that secularism was not merely a constitutional principle, but a constitutional culture, one that shapes how institutions behave and how citizens relate to one another. In Navtej Singh Johar versus Union of India, the decriminalization of homosexuality case, the Supreme Court held that constitutional morality obliges us to uphold the ideals of the Constitution, even when prevailing social views may disagree. At its essence, constitutional culture is formed not by the grand gestures, but the quiet ways in which a society learns to honor its own founding values. It takes shape in how we reason with one another, how we exercise power with a sense of responsibility, and how we respond when we see dignity being eroded. These are not dramatic acts. They are the slow, steady habits that reveal what a community truly believes. Over time, they become the ethical rhythm of public life, the unspoken understanding that fairness matters, that differences deserve respect, and the Constitution is not only to be read, but to be lived. One of the clearest illustrations of constitutional culture is found in how we respond to disagreement. India has always been a country where many beliefs and ways of life coexist, often uneasily, but with a shared commitment to mutual respect. In S. Rangarajan versus P. Jagjeevan Ram, the Supreme Court reminded us that a democracy must have the strength to tolerate opinions that unsettle us. The court observed that differing views cannot be silenced merely because a group finds them uncomfortable. The Constitution expects us to meet disagreement with maturity, not suppression. It is a quiet but powerful lesson that respecting difference is not a matter of convenience, but a matter and measure of our civic culture. Literature, whether in poetry or prose, pop music or pulsating rhythm, art or caricature, has the power to shake us from the comfort of the familiar. Literature and art make us alive to unseen stories of suffering and injustice and kindle hope amidst despair. We are pulled, whether willingly or by graphic persuasion, into the core of constitutional practice or culture. Constitutional culture also teaches us a certain self-restraint. In government of the National Capital Territory of Delhi versus Union of India, the Supreme Court stressed that in a democracy, institutions must act with mutual respect and constitutional trust, even when disagreements run deep. This is a form of civic discipline, an understanding that power must be exercised with humility and that knee-jerk impulses must be tempered by fairness. But perhaps the most important aspect of constitutional culture is in its insistence that dignity is non-negotiable. It is a culture that refuses to normalize cruelty, indifference, or humiliation. Whether it is the right of a disabled passenger to travel with dignity, the right of a young woman to make decisions about her own body, on when to terminate her pregnancy, the right of a street vendor to earn a livelihood, or the right of a protester to be heard, constitutional culture asks us to recognize each person as fully human and fully entitled to respect. In that sense, constitutional culture is not a theory. It is a continuing project of becoming a society that can bear its own diversity with maturity and acceptance. And it is through this culture, more than through any single institution or ideation, that a constitution lives from one generation to the next. The second question, what is citizenship? When we speak of citizenship, it is tempting to think of it as a matter of documents, a place of birth, a passport, a name on the electoral roll. And names on the electoral roll have become very crucial of late. But citizenship, as our constitutional tradition understands it, is something much deeper. It is a way of belonging to one another. It is a commitment to share in the life of a community, even when our histories and identities differ. The Constitution recognizes something quite simple, yet profound. Equality, dignity, and fraternity are not lofty ideas meant for textbooks. They are the conditions that allow a remarkably diverse people to live together with a sense of trust. Our courts have said this in different ways over the years. In the Hadia case, the court underscored that our constitutional order does not demand uniformity of choices. It requires respect for the freedom with which individuals shape their own lives. And in the Puttaswamy judgment on privacy, a 9-judge bench affirmed that each of us has the right to make choices that shape our identity. When we put these insights together, they tell us something essential about citizenship. It begins with recognizing that every individual carries their own sense of self, their own autonomy, their own story. And even when those choices do not resemble ours, they are entitled to the same respect that we expect for ourselves. That is the moral heart of citizenship in a constitutional democracy. India's pluralism is not accidental. It is civilizational. Over centuries, countless linguistic, religious, and cultural traditions have found place here. The Supreme Court acknowledged this in Nalsa versus Union of India, noting that the Constitution protects the diversity of identities that shape the Indian experience. Citizenship in such a society cannot be a narrow idea. It must be capacious enough to hold multitudes. It must invite participation rather than prescribe uniformity. Literature, too, has often understood this better than political theory. In his work, Leaves of Grass, which was a profoundly democratic project celebrating the individual and the diverse American populace, Walt Whitman wrote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. He meant that a citizen in a democracy must learn to recognize the inherent complexity and contradictions between themselves and within others, embracing a vision of society that can accommodate a range of different identities and viewpoints without enforcing uniformity. Our own Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore captured this even more beautifully. In the poem titled Bharat Tirtha, he wrote of India as the meeting place of countless currents, a confluence where the streams of the world meet and merge. The Constitution took that poetic intuition and turned it into an ethical project, that citizenship is not merely inherited, it is practiced through the willingness to see others as equally entitled to the nation which we all share. In this sense, citizenship is not a status, but a set of daily disciplines. It asks us to participate in public life with honesty. It asks us to approach disagreement with humility. It asks us to exercise our freedoms with a consciousness that they are part of a larger democratic fabric. And it asks us to accept that the well-being of the community is not the responsibility of the state alone, but is held in trust by each one of us. The Constitution expresses this through the fundamental duties. Article 51A does not impose penalties. Instead, it appeals to the conscience of citizens. It reminds us to cherish the values of the freedom struggle, to promote harmony, to protect the environment, to safeguard public property. These duties are phrased not as commands, but as invitations, a reminder that rights flourish fully only when citizens act with a sense of responsibility. The first Prime Minister of India remarked that citizenship consists in the service of the country. To serve is not merely to perform grand acts, it is to uphold dignity, fairness, and truth in the spaces of daily life. If we understand citizenship only as a legal entitlement, we miss its moral depth. A passport may tell us where we belong. The passport cannot tell us how to belong. The Constitution fills that gap. It asks us to build a society where freedom is matched by responsibility, where difference is met with respect, and where the dignity of each person becomes a shared commitment. That is the citizenship our founders envisioned, and it remains the citizenship we must strive to realize every day. Third, civic virtue. When we think about what keeps a republic steady, we often look first to its institutions, the courts, the legislature, the executive. But a deeper truth lies beneath that architecture. A democracy rests just as much on the character of her citizens, on the instincts we cultivate, and on the choices we make when no one else is watching. This inner discipline, this willingness to act for the common good, is what the philosophers once called civic virtue. Civic virtue does not demand heroism. It asks for something much short of it, and in many ways, more difficult: the readiness to put the public interest alongside our own. It appears in the small acts of decency that make collective life possible, in the restraint we show when anger is easier, in the honesty we practice even when it is inconvenient, in the kindness we extend to someone who may never know our name. These habits do not often make it to the headlines, but they shape the moral climate of a society far more than laws can. There is a reason why the philosopher Hannah Arendt warned us against what she called thoughtlessness. She believed that many of the world's deepest harms arise not from hatred, but from the refusal to reflect on the consequences of our actions. Civic virtue, then, begins with attentiveness, living in the present, the willingness to pause, to consider how our choices ripple outward, and to act with a sense of responsibility towards others. It is the opposite of indifference. We see this in play every day of our lives. When someone steps aside to let an ambulance pass, they are not following a constitutional provision, but they are honoring a constitutional value, the value of human life. When a citizen refuses to forward a false message received on the social media, even though it confirms their preconceptions, they are practicing a form of democratic honesty. When a person ungrudgingly makes way in a public space, or protects a tree in their neighborhood, or speaks up when a stranger is mistreated, they are participating in the shared work of sustaining a republic. These acts may seem small, but they teach a society how to care for itself. Civic virtue cannot be legislated. Parliament cannot compel empathy or respect or integrity. It can punish certain breaches of the law. These qualities take root in childhood, in schools that teach curiosity rather than fear, in families which encourage fairness, in workplaces that reward honesty, and in communities which refuse to normalize cruelty. They are nurtured by stories, by example, by the moral imagination of citizens who choose decency, not because they must, but because they believe it strengthens the society to which they belong. And this is perhaps the most important insight. Civic virtue is not an individual accomplishment. It is a collective inheritance. When enough people begin to act with a sense of responsibility in how they speak, how they argue, how they care, the entire atmosphere of public life begins to shift. Trust becomes possible, cooperation becomes natural, and democratic institutions which depend so heavily on public confidence are allowed to function with dignity. That is why civic virtue forms the moral core of a republic. It is the strength that binds the Constitution to the lives of ordinary people. It reminds us that democracy is not merely a system of government, it's a way of being with one another. And it is sustained not by the force of law, but by the courage, generosity, and conscience of her citizens. We often speak of the state as a guardian of constitutional values. It is true that institutions of governance carry immense responsibility. There's no denying that. But a republic cannot depend on the state alone. In fact, that's why Coimbatore is a living example of a city which is created by private initiative. Even the strongest institutions falter when the society around them grows cynical, divided, or indifferent. South Africa under apartheid had courts and a formal constitution, but they served a social order that normalized inequality. The constitutions of many communist regimes before Glasnost had exhortations on liberty and institutions in chambers with a grand architecture, but they lacked the architecture based on the moral compass of liberty. Institutions can exist on paper, functioning in appearance, and still fail in substance. What keeps a constitutional system alive is not its structure alone, but a society willing to hold that structure to its moral promise. At the same time, voluntary action cannot substitute for what the state must provide. A constitutional democracy works best when the two move in rhythm. When state institutions create the conditions for justice and equality, and citizens and civic bodies enrich those conditions through compassion, participation, and public spiritedness. The state builds this scaffolding. Society gives it life. It is in this interplay between institutional responsibility and civic initiative that constitutional culture finds its most enduring form. That's why during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the union government was dithering on whether to provide free vaccination, the Supreme Court took up the case suo motu, of our own accord. And we said, smell the coffee. You as the state are liable for public health. If you provide COVID vaccines free, irrespective of the cost, please take the responsibility and the credit. If you don't do it, we are going to order you to do it. And we know what a success story India had, not merely within the nation, but globally, in the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Now, what are the contemporary threats to constitutional culture? Every generation inherits not only a constitution, but also the anxieties on the age in which it must live. Today, in the course of my morning fireside chat, the question showed me the anxieties of today's generation. Our time is marked by extraordinary possibility and by challenges that test the habits of mind on which constitutional culture depends. Technology has placed more information at our fingertips than any previous civilization could imagine. But it has also made it harder to sift truth from noise. What technology has done is to break the feudal monopolies on information and knowledge.